Shabbat Shalom. I want to talk to you tonight about holiness, Kedushah. We translate the Hebrew word Kedushah as holy or holiness, but that translation doesn't quite capture what the word actually means. Kedushah comes from the root kadosh, which means to set something apart for a special purpose. When we say kiddushin, for example, at a wedding, we are acknowledging that these two people are set apart exclusively for one another. And when we say kiddush over the wine, we're setting this moment apart from other moments, or we're setting a particular day apart from the other days of the week. Kedushah is not a mystical experience reserved for saints. There's nothing magical about it. It's taking a moment or an object, a relationship, a life, and saying this means something extraordinary, something different. This is special. On my recent journey to Poland as part of March of the Living, I witnessed moments where the purpose of setting something aside was so clear that the ordinary world seemed to fall away. And I want to share a few of those moments with you tonight. What made each of them holy wasn't some sort of magic. It was purpose. 10 days ago, 40 of us set out on a journey from destruction to renewal, beginning in Krakow. 1 hour from Auschwitz-Birkenau, we came to bear witness, to learn about our past, and to support one another. There were altogether about 7,500 people on this march, mostly teenagers, adult community members as well, and several dozen survivors on a pilgrimage of memory. There were about 50 more survivors that were supposed to come from Israel, but because of the recent war, sort of the war within the war within the war, the planes were canceled and they weren't all able to make it. The trip was filled with grief and with weight. We stood at one point on our journey in what remains of the Tarnow synagogue, once a grand structure now reduced to almost nothing but a bima, no walls even, standing alone in the open air like a monument to absence. Our guide, as we were getting ready to go to the synagogue, asked if I would lead the congregation, our community, in something joyous when we got there. And I grabbed my guitar and we sang a nigun that surely echoed melodies that once were shared in that place before the destruction. And then we went from this bima, this synagogue in Tarnow, to the outskirts of town that holds the remains of over 800 children in a mass grave. We visited Majdanek, its memorial containing over 7 tons of human ash. And yet, that was not the only experience we had. There was also Shabbat in Warsaw, where hundreds of us came together to sing and to raise our voices. And I was privileged to, along with several of my colleagues, lead services in the egalitarian community. It was really beautiful. And we were in a building that was actually once right inside the walls of the Warsaw Ghetto. And then at the end of our journey, we celebrated Havdalah together. And ordinarily, the big celebration of the March of the Living trip happens at the end in Israel. But because we weren't able to go to Israel this year because of the war, they decided to make the last night in Poland especially joyous. And so we had music and then a DJ. And at one point, I looked up and I saw a man who must have been in his mid-90s, a survivor of the Holocaust, dancing with a group of teenagers from Panama. There was this huge contingent of kids from Panama, and they were having such fun. And he was just grinning from ear to ear, hugging. It was really, really beautiful and special and unexpected. That was not on the itinerary. It didn't say that we were going to witness that moment, and it was just beautiful. So even though there were these moments of sadness, there was also joy and renewal, and there was this sense of Kedusha, which is what I want to talk about tonight. And it connects to what Rabbi Josh shared with us at the beginning, the double portion that we read this week for Shabbat, Acharei Mot Kedoshim. From time to time, in order to accommodate all of the parshiot in the Torah, the rabbis put two portions together. And these two come together as a type of sermon. Acharei Mot is the Torah portion that talks about what happens after Aaron's sons die, Nadav and Avihu, and some of the rules that God gives us about offering sacrifice that seem to be connected to their death. And then Parashat Kedoshim includes some of the most beautiful sections of Leviticus, including the commandment to love our neighbor as ourselves. But when you put these two parshiot together, you actually get a mini sermon. Acharei Mot, after death, Kedoshim, there is holiness. So I want to talk about how death doesn't have to be an end. Through memory, through the values left behind by our loved ones, we can find and we can even make moments of holiness, moments of purpose. And so I want to share 3 of those moments with you this evening. The first moment was one that I experienced when I was walking the infamous train tracks of Birkenau. And I noticed as we were moving towards the area that they'd set up as sort of the stage for the ceremony, which chillingly was between 2 of the destroyed crematoria. And on the way to that spot, I noticed this train track, and on the track was a cattle car, one of the cattle cars from World War II itself. And near this car, there were a bunch of people gathered around, and there was a sign that said, members of the Israel Defense Forces, and we saw a bunch of soldiers there in uniform from the various branches of the IDF, someone from the Air Force and someone from infantry. And then as I got closer, I noticed a diminutive woman, probably about 4'10", standing there. I saw her name tag, Tova Friedman, and she was telling her story of coming with her family to that very place as a child, and of the selection that was made and how in the most unlikely fashion she managed to survive. And then I noticed standing right next to her, this man staring intently at her, and in fact he had his phone out, he was filming her. And then my jaw dropped because I recognized him. It was Omri Miran, who was the very last hostage to be released after 738 days of captivity. And we prayed for him week after week after week here. His hostage poster, he had this fantastic smile. And though I'd never met him prior to that day, I always kind of connected with him. He has 2 little daughters. And I just always in some way resonated with that face and his story as well. And there he was filming this Holocaust survivor. And it was so beautiful and poignant to watch one survivor witnessing the story of this other survivor, the living memory of the Shoah reaching across the decades to touch the open wound of October 7th. And then when Tova finished speaking, it was actually quite an Israeli moment because Tova was speaking in English and she had an Israeli handler who was sort of explaining things to her, interrupting her, directing her, telling her what to do. And she just went along with it. It was quite fabulous. But then someone came over and introduced Omri to Tova and explained to Tova who he was. And he held her in his arms and gave her this sweet kiss on her head. And it was just so beautiful. These 2 human beings separated by 80 years of history were each set apart by their suffering. And in that embrace, they were set apart together. Each saying to the other, your survival is not accidental. You're here for a purpose. You're here for a reason. And it was truly a moment of Kedusha, of holiness. The second moment of Kedusha happened in Lublin. I had the opportunity to teach a Torah study session in the great Lublin Yeshiva, which I'd never been to before, but I'd heard about throughout my life as a student of Torah. It was considered perhaps the very greatest yeshiva in all of Europe, not just because of the quality of the learning, which was exalted, but the building itself was quite beautiful. When you think of a traditional Middle or Eastern European yeshiva, you think of a little building with a dirt floor, but the Lublin yeshiva wasn't like that. It was this gorgeous structure. The building survived the war, and unfortunately now, though, it no longer functions as a yeshiva because there are almost no Jews left in Lublin. At one time, there was 50, 60,000 Jews there, and almost all of them were killed. It functions as a hotel, and it's still owned by the Jewish community, but there is, in the middle of it, a working synagogue that's used mostly by tourists. And there are books and photographs of the great sages who once filled its walls. And so I chose a text to share that night, and the text I chose asks, in some ways, the hardest question of all. If God is good and just and all-powerful, how can there be suffering in the world? And the answer the Talmud gives us doesn't offer easy comfort. It tells us that the world is a sulam ra'ua, a rickety or a wobbly ladder. And it suggests that sometimes as we climb this wobbly ladder, we fall. That's how it is with wobbly ladders. But we don't really have a choice. Somehow we have to go up. It's similar to the metaphor that the great Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav uses, that the world is a very narrow bridge. And the important thing is not to panic. Somehow you have to get on the bridge. And so to be able to teach a text like that in a place like that was simply a privilege. And there we were, more than 40 of us learning together in this historic place. And when we finished and walked downstairs to go and get on our bus to go to our next site, we saw a group of Hasidic men coming up the stairs, getting ready to use the sanctuary as a place of prayer. And as I was going down the stairs and they were coming up, I greeted each one. I said, Shalom Aleichem. And they responded, Alechem Shalom. And even though their Judaism looks very different from ours, in that exchange, I felt our shared history and our shared destiny in a very deep and beautiful way. So what was the purpose of this moment of Kedusha? And I think that in that room on that day, we were doing what Jews have always done in the face of the unthinkable, asking the hardest questions together rather than alone. Torah study is not an escape from grief. It is the Jewish response to grief. That act of learning in that place was Kedusha, setting ourselves apart from despair and dedicating ourselves to meaning. And the third moment of Kedusha came actually after our journey as a group came to an end. Because, as I mentioned earlier, of the war with Iran, the Israel portion of the march was canceled this year. So Jacqueline and I decided to stay on to visit a few of the small towns where members of my family had lived before the war. And first we went to a town very difficult to spell and also difficult to say. It's one of two words I know in Hungarian, Sátoralja Újhely. And there we had a remarkable encounter with a couple from Brooklyn who told us that, well, first they asked us, they said, why are you here? Are you here for the yortzeit of the Charister Rebbe? And we said, no, we're not. We're here because we have family that are from this place. And they said, oh my goodness. Do you know the Charister Rebbe was famous for his midah of haknasat orchim, his attribute of welcoming the stranger. So it's no accident. It can't be an accident that you're here on the eve of his yortzeit. The Charister Rebbe invited you here. And it was this beautiful image. And she said it with such conviction that we believed it too. And so we changed our plan, even though we were only going to be there for about a day and a half. We switched things up, and the next morning we got up early and we drove about 30 minutes away from Châteauroux to a town called Carrister. And it was quite a scene. First of all, we're in this small Hungarian town, and everywhere were signs in Yiddish explaining where the shuttles, spelled in Hebrew letters, where the shuttles were. Believe it or not, there is no ancient Hebrew or Yiddish word for shuttle. But you would get on the shuttle to go from the Rebbe of Carrister's synagogue up the hill to his burial place. And there were signs telling everyone where the bathrooms were. It was amazing. When I went into the synagogue, Jacqueline went into the women's section. I went into the men's section. I put on my tefillin and talit, and I was the only guy there who looked like me. Everyone else had peyot and a beard and a black hat. And of course, a room full of Jews, there were people raising money for tzedakah. How could there not be? So almost immediately, a guy came over to me and said, tzedakah, tzedakah? So I said, of course. I said, but I have no money. He pulls out a little electronic credit card, wireless. I'm not making this up. I have pictures. Holds it in his hand. Apple Pay, tap. So I go to tap, and he says, how much? I said, chai, $18. He said, could you give 36? I said, this guy's good. Should get him. We're going to get him on our development team here at Stephen Wise Temple. So I tapped for 36. Well, once they saw me tap, it was like fresh meat, They descended. And so finally I was like, is it okay if I pray a little bit? So I said a few prayers, and then I found Jacqueline, and we decided to walk up to the Carrister Rebbe's tomb. And when we got up there, it was an amazing scene. Hundreds of people up there, and people come with these little notes that they write, almost like you were at the Kotel, and they place the note on the tomb of the Rebbe. And it was just moving and beautiful. And to think about this town that once was filled with Jewish life. It was the home of the Carrister Rebbe, and now it's the home of the Carrister Rebbe's grave. But a couple of times a year, Jews come and they gather. And this idea that a Rebbe known for welcoming strangers somehow drew us, his people, our people, to his graveside on the anniversary of his death was a reminder of something holy. We are still here. That is not a coincidence. That's a sense of obligation, honoring the dead by thriving among the living. Acharei mot kedoshim, after death, holiness. The Torah, by the way, isn't saying that holiness follows death automatically. It's saying that holiness is a choice we make in response to death. And look at the choices we witnessed on this journey. A tender kiss on a survivor's forehead on the very tracks where over 1.5 million of our people were murdered. 40 people cracking open a sacred text in the synagogue of what was once the greatest yeshiva in Europe, a building that survived the Holocaust and now stands as a hotel in a city nearly emptied of Jewish life. And yet there we were, studying the same Torah that has animated our people for 3,000 years. And then a quiet detour to honor an invitation from a Rebbe we barely knew, next to a town our family once called home. These are not grand gestures, but they are examples of Kedusha, of holiness, moments set apart, dedicated to something larger than ourselves, animated by purpose. And here's what I want you to hear most clearly tonight. These moments are not reserved for those who are fortunate enough to take a journey like this. These moments are available to every single one of us, every single day, every hour. Every time you come to this sanctuary and set apart an hour in the noise of your week, whether you do so in person or whether you're joining us from home, that is Kedusha. And every time you sit down and study and wrestle with a hard question or with a text, whether on your own or online or at our Shabbat morning Torah study, that is Kedusha. Every time you give tzedakah and designate your resources for something beyond yourself, that is Kedusha. The question the Torah puts before us tonight is not whether holy moments are possible in the world we live in. We know they are. The question is whether we will choose them, whether we will show up, whether we will notice them and acknowledge them, showing up to this sanctuary, to our tradition, to one another, with enough intention and commitment to make them happen. So the invitation is to commit to being a little bit more committed. 5%, 10%, 18, 36, you figure it out. But being a little bit more committed to our tradition and to one another with enough intention and energy to make those moments happen. This is what Kedusha means. It's what it's all about. It's what it's always meant. And it is, I believe with all my heart, exactly what we are here to do. Shabbat Shalom.